Kia ora, I'm Lee Madam McLaughlin.
And I'm William Ray.
Welcome to the Aotearoa History Show.
The 60s, 70s and 80s were very rowdy decades.
The Māori land protests were just one part of an explosion of movements which sprang up covering everything from women's liberation to opposition to nuclear weapons. Plus, the single most controversial event in New Zealand sporting history.
That's right, the 1981 underarm bowling incident.
No, I'm talking about the Springbok Tour.
Part of what kicked off all these protest movements was a generational change. Kiwis who had lived through the World Wars and the Great Depression wanted stability, and it finally felt like they'd got it.
Unemployment had all but vanished. Government welfare and superannuation provided a safety net for Kiwis from cradle to grave.
In 1963, the National Party's campaign slogan was literally just, "Steady does it."
But the baby boomers had different ideas. They saw a society which felt stagnant, conservative and old-fashioned.
And as the years went on, the people challenging that society got louder and louder.
First, let's look at the women's movements. In the 50s and 60s, their biggest focus was on financial independence.
The lack of equal pay made it extremely difficult for single women to live independently. In 1949, the arbitration court set the minimum wage for women at 70% the male rate. In the public sector, women's pay was capped at a far lower rate than men, which prevented women from rising to more senior positions.
This caused a huge fight in the mid-50s when a government worker called Jean Parker had her pay cut as punishment for challenging the system. The backlash was so strong that both Labour and National adopted equal pay for public servants as part of their election campaigns. This was made law in 1960, although it would be several more decades before women really had equal career opportunities in the public sector. Arguably, they still don't.
There was also a fight for equal pay in the private sector. For the most part, men were seen as the breadwinners. Women might work while they were single, but once they got married, their role was in the home.
But in reality, married women had become a vital part of the workforce. The expanding post-war economy had created significant labour shortages, and increasing numbers of married women were taking up paid jobs.
Yeah, like here's a quote from a conference held in 1964 on the role of women in society. If married women stopped work overnight, 100,000 children would have to be sent home from school because over 2,500 married women are active teachers. 10% of the people in hospital would lack adequate nursing care because 1,400 nurses would have to be withdrawn. The equivalent of 20% of shops of all kinds would have to close down. Something like 2,000 businesses of various types would lose their managers.
As we got into the 1970s, the women's movement broadened its focus beyond economics. There were growing calls to liberalise access to abortion, contraceptives and sex education. Plus, women were just fed up of the sexist assumption of mainstream Kiwi society. The idea that women should do all the cooking and cleaning and that they should dress and behave a certain way.
These things had always been challenged by a minority of feminist activists, but now there was a mass movement of young women who were prepared to openly challenge sexism. A turning point came on Suffrage Day in 1972, when a group of young women staged a mock funeral in Auckland's Albert Park to mourn the lack of progress since women won the right to vote.
This protest got national media coverage and created a surge of interest in feminism from women around the country.
By the end of 1972, New Zealand had at least 20 women's liberation groups.
But this wasn't just one big unified movement. There were internal divisions, particularly when it came to the rights of lesbians and Māori women. Ngā Hui Te Awe Kōtuku is a Māori lesbian activist and academic, and in the 1970s, she challenged the movement over its focus on married, middle-class white women. She shocked the entire country when she went on TV and openly discussed the existence of lesbians.
The gay rights movement was also picking up steam in the 1970s.
Over the years, penalties have included flogging and imprisonment. Some gay people were incarcerated in mental health institutions. In 1964, a man called Alan Aberhart was beaten to death in Hagley Park in Christchurch by a group of teenagers who claimed he'd asked them for sex.
They were tried for murder, but found not guilty.
The early LGBT rights movement made many attempts to change the law. They finally succeeded with the 1986 Homosexual Law Reform Act and the 1993 Human Rights Act. The first act decriminalised gay sex and the second outlawed discrimination for sexual orientation or gender identity.
The mood for change infected politics. It was probably best embodied by Norman Kirk, who led the Labour Party to victory in 1972.
Kirk's government engaged with the protest movements. His administration ended New Zealand's involvement in the Vietnam War and introduced the domestic purposes benefit. The DPB did a lot to support single mothers and women who are trying to leave abusive relationships.
But the Kirk government came unstuck in 1974, partly because Kirk himself suddenly died from illness, partly because of an economic crisis, and partly thanks to his government's decision to block the Springbok rugby team from touring New Zealand.
New Zealand had a long relationship with South Africa on the rugby field. Matches between the Springboks and the All Blacks drew enormous crowds in New Zealand as far back as 1921.
But there was a big problem in that relationship. In 1948, the white minority South African government introduced the Apartheid Policy, a series of laws explicitly designed to separate the races.
Black people were forced into shanty towns away from white neighbourhoods. There were black and white shops, black and white drinking fountains, black and white schools.
The crunch point came in 1968 when the United Nations called for a sporting boycott as one way of putting pressure on the South African government to end apartheid.
New Zealanders were divided on whether to go along with this plan. Many hardcore rugby fans argued that politics should be kept out of sport.
The other side argued that breaking the UN's boycott would be seen as tacit support for the apartheid regime.
The argument got increasingly heated, and when the Labour government stepped in to block the Springboks from touring, there was a huge backlash from rugby fans who threw their support behind Robert Muldoon's National Party.
Muldoon was personally opposed to apartheid, but he promised not to intervene in any future tours, and his party won a landslide victory in the 1975 election. Robert Muldoon's probably the most polarising figure in New Zealand political history. His approach to politics was my way or the highway, like literally, My Way is the title of his autobiography. He served as both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, which gave him enormous personal power over how the country was run.
Muldoon's victory in 1975 was partly thanks to rugby, but also thanks to his party's promise of a universal tax-funded superannuation scheme. This policy was very appealing for older Kiwis, but it became a huge weight around the neck of the New Zealand economy.
And let's just have a look at that economy for a minute. By this point, successive governments had boosted local industry through something called protectionism, heavily taxing or banning overseas imports and subsidising locally produced products. So in the 1970s, if you wanted to buy a car or a TV, you pretty much had to buy one that was made in a New Zealand factory.
These policies were great for employment. In the 50s and 60s, unemployment was so low that people joked that the Minister of Social Security knew every dole recipient by name.
But there was a problem with protectionism. We had to import a lot of the raw materials these factories needed, but the products they produced were so expensive they couldn't be sold overseas.
This meant a lot of money was flowing out of Aotearoa, and that eventually became unsustainable, particularly after oil prices spiked sharply in the 1970s, which sucked even more money out of the local economy.
One solution was to stop protecting unproductive industries and focus on competing in areas where we actually had an advantage on the global stage. Stop building TVs, start investing in dairy factories.
But that would have caused big job losses as the local factories shut down. Muldoon wasn't willing to let that happen, and he also wasn't willing to cut welfare spending to reduce public debt. Instead, he significantly increased that debt with something called Think Big.
Basically, this was a series of massive industrial projects, mostly focused on new energy schemes like hydroelectric dams and natural gas facilities. The idea was that this energy could be harnessed to build up new industries like steel and aluminium manufacturing, which would bring in more export dollars. It would also make New Zealand less dependent on oil imports.
But a lot of these projects ran massively over budget and failed to deliver the kind of benefits Muldoon was hoping for. Plus, these projects prompted huge opposition from a new environmental movement.
In the 60s and 70s, lots of Kiwis had finally realised that our native plants and animals were in a desperate situation. Decades of forest clearance and predation had taken many right to the brink of extinction.
People rallied to protect Aotearoa's last bastions of native bush. One of the environmentalists' biggest victories was the Save Manipuri campaign. Nearly 10% of New Zealanders signed a petition against National's plan to flood the bush surrounding Lake Manipuri as part of a massive new hydropower scheme. Norman Kirk's opposition to the dam helped him win the 1972 election. A few years later, 340,000 people signed the Māori Declaration, which proposed a ban on logging native trees.
Muldoon's Think Big projects often ran into a lot of opposition from environmentalists, but the biggest protests of his administration had to do with rugby. In 1981, Muldoon followed through on his promise to allow the Springboks to tour New Zealand.
Anti-apartheid activists were furious. Most games saw massive protests.
The biggest anti-tour organisation was HART, Halt All Racist Tours. Another big group was the Patu Squad, a Māori activist group which had grown out of earlier protest movements like the 1975 Land March and the occupation at Bastion Point. The goals of these protest groups overlapped, but there was also division. Māori activists emphasised New Zealand's own problems with racism and the importance of Māori self-determination. Pākehā protesters weren't always on board with those goals.
As the tour went on, the conflict between pro and anti-tour New Zealanders got increasingly intense. There were pitch invasions and flower bombings.
Sports fans clashed violently with protesters.
Families fought over the tour at the dinner table.
Workmates got into shouting matches in pubs.
And while he claimed to oppose the tour personally, Muldoon's government capitalised on the unrest by painting the protesters as criminals and using the issue to win support in the 1981 election.
But the next 3 years were a disaster for the Muldoon government. Inflation and public debt were both rising rapidly. Muldoon tried to find a way through by micromanaging the economy in ways that seem bizarre by modern standards. Like for the final 2 years of his government, he froze wages and the prices of consumer products. This was all part of a last-ditch effort to combat inflation.
Muldoon's own colleagues in the National Party were getting increasingly worried about all of this. But the nuclear-free debate, not economics, provided the flashpoint that ended his time in power. Our anti-nuclear stance grew out of opposition to French nuclear tests in the Pacific. And in the early 70s, the Kirk government sent Navy frigates to Muldoon Atoll by way of protest.
The Australian and New Zealand governments took France to the World Court, but the French ignored the court's ruling to end its tests.
The other big focus of the nuclear-free movement was warships. The movement wanted to make New Zealand a nuclear-free zone.
This would mean blocking ships from the United States Navy from visiting New Zealand, because the US had a policy of neither confirming or denying if its ships carried nukes.
But blocking our allies in the USA from visiting New Zealand was a very controversial move, and the debate raged in public. Muldoon was convinced that New Zealand's security depended on staying in the USA's good books. Banning their ships from our ports could seriously undermine that relationship.
But members of Muldoon's own party were fed up with his dictatorial style of government.
The final straw came on June 14, 1984, when National MP Marilyn Waring said she'd crossed the floor to vote for a nuclear-free New Zealand. Be it for reasons of political stability or political opportunism, the Prime Minister decided enough was enough. That night, Muldoon called a snap election and appeared on TV to explain his decision, but he was very clearly drunk at the time.
Have we got a date, Prime Minister?
We got a date, the 14th of July, which we've worked out at Government House as being the appropriate date.
That doesn't give you much time to run up to an election, Prime Minister.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
1 month later, voters went to the polls and National lost in a landslide.
Labour soon announced that it would ban nuclear-powered ships and those likely to be nuclear-armed from visiting New Zealand.
The United States government was furious. It effectively expelled us from the ANZUS alliance and downgraded our official status from ally to friend.
But that diplomatic fight was massively overshadowed on July 10th, 1985. Late that night, 2 explosions ripped through the hull of the Rainbow Warrior, a Greenpeace protest vessel which was tied up at Marsden Wharf in Auckland. One of the ship's crew, Fernando Pereira, was trapped inside the sinking ship and drowned.
A police investigation revealed the bombing had been carried out by French secret agents who were trying to stop the Rainbow Warrior protesting at Mururoa. Most of those agents escaped, but 2 were captured and convicted of manslaughter.
The French government denied everything, then used its influence to block New Zealand's access to European trade markets.
Britain, Australia and the USA all refused to step in to help, so New Zealand took the case to the United Nations.
The UN ruled that the French were responsible for the bombing and persuaded France to pay $13 million in compensation, promised to stop interfering in New Zealand's trade and make an official apology.
In September 1985, Prime Minister Laurent Fabius said this: "The truth is cruel. Agents of the French Secret Service sank this boat. They were acting on orders."
For Kiwis, this was a huge moment. New Zealand had taken on a global superpower, and we'd won.
It turned out we didn't need the support of the British Empire or American military might to make our way in the world. And ever since, New Zealanders have taken pride in our independent foreign policy, the idea that we stick up for what we think is right, not just doing what our allies want us to do. Thanks for joining us on the Aotearoa History Show, produced by RNZ and made possible by the RNZ New Zealand On Air Digital Innovation Fund.